Okay, we want to turn now to the federal government's handling of this convoy protest. Marco Mendicino is the Minister for Public Safety. He's in Ottawa. Minister Mendicino, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start, if I can, sir, with how the financial measures in the emergency orders are being used so far. We're told that bank accounts are being frozen, but nobody will say how many. Why can't we know how many bank accounts have been targeted by this action?
Out of respect for operational independence and sensitivity, the powers that we have introduced under the emergency declaration are to be used by law enforcement and in some cases financial institutions like banks. But as they are carrying out those powers in conjunction with investigations and other enforcement actions, it's important that we respect the boundaries. Our job in the elected government is to pass those tools and into law, as we have done through the declaration under the Emergencies Act, and it is up to law enforcement to use them responsibly. As you know, they have to be done in a very targeted and time-limited manner and respectful of the Charter, and we have every confidence that's how they're being exercised.
Well, then I wonder, what's the threshold for using these tools? I mean, do you have to be physically at the protest to have your bank account frozen? Do you have to be one of the organizers, or is there a level of financial contribution that triggers this sort of action on your bank account?
Yeah, it's a good question. At the end of the day, we expect that police and law enforcement will exercise those thresholds on a practical level when there is a reasonable basis to do so. Looking for evidence and information that connects the individual to the illegal blockade would be one of those thresholds. But I would also point out that, again, that there are charter protections built into the Emergencies Act. So they can't be used in an unbridled or in a reckless way. There has to be a balancing of, for example, Section 8, which protects everyone's right to be subject to a search that is unreasonable. That would apply in the case of the Emergencies Act. There's also the protection under Section 7 of the Charter, which gives Canadians due process rights. These are really important safeguards, which of course are integrated into the declaration and all of the powers included in it, including the financial controls that you mentioned.
But so what sort of target did Cabinet have in mind when it executed this order? Because I understand the police will have to enforce this, but you guys drafted this. I mean, are you going after the big truck owners? Are you going after the heavy donors? I mean, who should Canadians expect are at risk under these orders?
Well, I understand why you're asking, but here again, it is not for the government to target particular individuals or categories of individuals. It is for police to do that on the basis of the evidence that they are collecting. And that highlights the distinction between the two functions that we serve. Elected governments set policy, set laws, and those laws become tools, practical applications for law enforcement and other partners to enforce it and uphold it. There's obviously a great desire to know exactly who and how many, and it may be that in conjunction with law enforcement that we're able to communicate and say more about that. And certainly over the course of the next number of days with debate in the House and the ultimate mandatory review, there will be discussion about that. But for now, there needs to be operational independence and sensitivity out of respect for and the integrity of the actions that are being carried out by law enforcement.
Okay, so one more question on the financial aspects and about this is, how long will it last? I mean, if you leave the protests and stop participating, do you get your bank account back? I mean, when this order expires in 30 days, do you get it back then? Or does this run the risk of being a permanent thing and maybe seeing someone getting debanked by their financial institution?
Yeah, and it's for that reason that we keep emphasizing that charter protections will circumscribe the extent to which those authorities can be exercised. So, it seems to me that it would be, quite beyond the scope to have some power exercised without any defined limit. But that will be up to police to determine as they are carrying out their investigations. And there will be protections built into it. There will be a review. There will be a joint parliamentary committee to ensure that those powers are being used responsibly in a temporary way and consistent with the Charter. And of course, those individuals also have the courts to their option to plead the case. So there are a number of protections that are built into the case, but right now we are very much seized with the issue that confronts us, and that's ending the blockades as quickly and as peacefully as we can.
Okay, and in making the case yesterday for the need to invoke these emergency powers, you suggested there was a link between the armed protesters that were arrested in Coutts, Alberta, and massive amounts of weapons seized, and the people occupying Ottawa. Do you believe there are heavily armed people here in the capital city?
Well, I've been asked that question about the presence of firearms, and it's not for me to answer those questions. Those are questions that are best put to police. I think we're all generally concerned for public safety. Whether it's here in Ottawa based on the way things have gone over the last 3+ weeks, or at our borders where we have seen supply chains interrupted, where we've seen the economy take a huge hit, where we've seen people lose their jobs, we've seen plants closed. My job, and I think the job of the federal government collectively, is to look at the big picture here and to ask ourselves, what additional tools do we need to put into effect to bring about the end of the illegal blockades? That's why we invoked the Emergencies Act. We didn't do it, willy-nilly. We gave a lot of thought to it. We consulted our experts. We've now drawn deep into the toolbox, and we hope that by invoking it, that the powers will be used responsibly, proportionately, so that we can bring about the end of the blockades.
Well, the big picture right now, though, Minister, is that all the border crossings have been cleared. I know there was an attempt to reoccupy Windsor, but that was intercepted by police. And a lot of these were done without the extra tools from the Emergency Act. So is this now not a national emergency to deal with what is a local policing problem in the downtown core of Ottawa?
No, I think it's far too soon to be uncorking the champagne bottles on this, Dave. I think we're in a very precarious moment where, yes, we have seen progress, where blockades have come down at various ports of entry, including some since we exercised the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But, progress is not necessarily cast in stone. And just yesterday, there were efforts by a number of individuals to put up another blockade in Windsor. Earlier today, I was very alarmed to hear about reports of threats of violence being visited upon the mayor in Windsor, Drew Dilkins. I think we have to be very mindful that we are not out of the illegal blockade situation, that the Emergencies Act is a tool that is being invoked so that we can try to understand exactly what it is that we're dealing with, but at the same time, provide the tools and the equipment and all of the personnel that are necessary for law enforcement to address it as quickly as possible.
Okay, law enforcement in Ottawa has rolled out some new measures this afternoon to address what's happening in the city, setting up a hardened perimeter largely around the entire core of the downtown and saying nobody who doesn't live in that region or have a lawful reason to be there, such as work or as a medical appointment, can get in. So they've taken those steps, but you've heard the comments from the protesters, Minister. You've seen them, outside Parliament, and you've seen the lack of movement. I mean, how optimistic are you that this can be resolved without aggressive police enforcement and the potential that could lead to violence?
I think I share a similar assessment to you do, which is that it is a complex situation, that the blockades in Ottawa are entrenched, that they are not only downtown, but they have found themselves into neighborhoods and communities. And I think that the complete sense of exasperation, frustration, and outright anger by people who live in Ottawa is totally justified. And at the same time, I do sense that from the Ottawa Police Service, that there has been somewhat of, I think, an activation, if I could put it that way. But at the end of the day, we have to trust the people in uniform, the members of our law enforcement, to do the job. They've been able to do it in other communities. They've been able to do it at the border. And our sincere hope is they're going to be able to bring about the fast and peaceful resolution of the blockades in Ottawa as well.
But Minister, here it is, day 21. And you've invoked the Emergencies Act. I mean, another weekend is coming up, and that's when the reinforcements tend to swell things. If we get to Monday and this is still going on and they're able to have another party in the downtown core of Ottawa, I mean, what does that say about your government, the provincial government, and the municipal government's ability to control the national capital?
Well, look, let's hope it doesn't come to that. And certainly there seems to be some strong signals that law enforcement is taking the preparatory steps that are necessary to avoid another weekend like the last three in Ottawa, which nobody wants, particularly those who are living in the downtown core. But I do think that the fact that you are raising the question does in a way, underline the ongoing need to have those additional powers, which are listed in the declaration and in the rules of the Emergencies Act. It's not something, again, that we're doing with great zeal or enthusiasm. It's a last resort. It's something that we did after very careful deliberation, but having invoked it, we certainly hope that law enforcement will put it to good use so that we don't have another weekend here in Ottawa, so that we don't have another border shut down, because Canadians have a right to economic and job security. They have a right to public safety, and we're going to continue to do everything that we can to assure that is something that they can all enjoy.
Okay, Minister, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
As opposition parties continue to press the federal government to justify invoking the Emergencies Act. We're joined now by two MPs. Conservative Party MP Michelle Rempel is in Calgary, and NDP MP Alistair McGregor is in Duncan, British Columbia. I'd like to thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Michelle Rempel, I'd like to start with you. You've asked Canada's Privacy Commissioner to begin an investigation into the state of Canadians' privacy rights in the context of the invocation of the Emergencies Act. What's your biggest concern there?
This is an unprecedented step in Canadian history. I want to be clear. The illegal blockades that are happening in Ottawa, they need to end. I encourage people to go home. The federal government, too, that has not made the case for the use of the Emergencies Act. There's many people who are concerned about this across all political stripe, and ensuring that Canadians' privacies and rights are respected as this unprecedented step has been taken, I think needs to be paramount. This shouldn't be a partisan political issue. We're in uncharted territory here, and at the end of the day, we all need to be working to make sure that Canadians' rights are upheld.
Right. So what is your significant concern here? I know there's a lot of questions about the freezing of the bank accounts for people who are involved with this protest, but you've just called this an illegal occupation. I mean, if you are funding illegal activity, isn't it typical to have the financing of that frozen?
There are laws in place in Canada that have judicial oversight that can address these types of situations. The government has not communicated why those laws are not sufficient and why they need to move essentially without judicial oversight. I'm very concerned that without specifying why or how or under what time period or scope, Canadians could have their bank accounts frozen. Think about that for a second. And I mean, on another television program last night, the Solicitor General said that when asked, he said people who had a certain political proclivity could be concerned about having their bank accounts frozen. And to me, again, regardless of how you vote, politicians shouldn't be saying things like that in a free and open democracy. And we should be concerned about whether or not the Charter has the ability to bound the enormous powers that this act gives the federal government. And I think that all politicians should be holding the government to account for that.
Mr. McGregor, do you share Ms. Rempel-Garner's concerns here on the freezing of bank accounts connected to this occupation of downtown Ottawa and the other blockades?
Well, I agree with her that it is certainly unprecedented. But David, my focus is really on the residents, the workers, and small businesses of Ottawa who have had to endure a siege for the last 2.5 weeks. We should always be concerned when an act is brought into force for the very first time. But I want to let people know that within this act, it is subservient to the Charter, and there are mechanisms within the statute that allow for strong parliamentary oversight. I want to make it clear that our focus is on giving people's freedoms back in downtown Ottawa. They should not be subjected to this for one day longer. And when it comes to the use of these extraordinary powers, we will not be handing the government a blank check on this. We will be reviewing every single action they take to make sure it is proportionate, specific, and temporary. And if we at any time feel they are overstepping their bounds, we will not hesitate to withdraw our support.
Right. So I wonder, though, if the Charter protection guarantee or assurance is enough. I mean, I know we count on our law enforcement all the time to uphold the Charter. It doesn't always happen. I'm sure these financial institutions that are being asked to do this will consult heavily with legal counsel just to protect their own interests. I mean, should that be enough assurance to Canadians, given the concerns that Ms. Rempel-Garner is raising?
I think so. I mean, again, I want to assure people there are mechanisms here to allow for parliamentary oversight. The thing to keep focused on is the fact that residents, workers, and businesses in downtown Ottawa have been subjected to this for 2.5 weeks. It is an illegal occupation of their hometown, and they need relief. We are in this position because of a clear demonstration of lack of leadership from the federal government. There has been no enforcement. And yes, it is a sledgehammer. But again, we are here because of the lack of action from the federal government over the last 2.5 weeks. And I am focused on trying to give those workers, small businesses, and residents relief from the siege they are currently occupying or experiencing.
Right. Ms. Rempel-Garner, on that point, right, it's when it was left to the city, they didn't act. When Doug Ford invoked a state of emergency here, it didn't work. We are seeing some change now that the Emergencies Act has been put in place here. I mean, does Mr. McGregor have a point that this was just needed to give the people who live in downtown Ottawa their lives back?
Well, I agree with Mr. McGregor that there was a systemic failure of leadership, but I will disagree with him that somehow Parliament has oversight or any sort of visibility on what's happening with the Emergencies Act. I mean, we're dealing with a federal government that took the Speaker of the House of Commons to court over an order of Parliament to have documents released. We don't know what the government's doing with freezing of bank accounts, and how would we? I'm not convinced that this actually meets the charter tests, particularly under Section 8 with regard to search and seizure. There's many people who are asking these questions, and I don't understand why the residents of downtown Ottawa can't have safety and security in their communities without having the potential of civil liberties suspended. And I think that giving the federal government without this type of unprecedented power, without those checks in place, is actually an abrogation of like the duty of every parliamentarian, regardless of political stripe. And the reality is that the federal government has other tools at its disposal under existing laws that it chose not only not to implement, but not to explain to Parliament why they weren't using those prior to going to the Emergencies Act. And for that reason, I think that every parliamentarian should be opposing it until the federal government does that, or at least looks at some sort of a charter reference to explain how the charter is actually bounding what they're doing, which Parliament doesn't even understand the full scope of.
Right.
So I don't even think the federal government is offering briefings to parliamentarians right now on the scope of the crisis, what they've done, what they're doing. It's a lot of things just in the media. And with this type of unprecedented power, like Canadians right now need to have trust that their law enforcement works and their democracy works. And how can we do that without that information? And I just think that the NDP giving the Liberals carte blanche on this without that level of scrutiny is highly problematic.
Okay, Mr. McGregor, one last question for you, and it's a response to something that was said in the debate today when Candace Bergen called on the NDP to vote down the measure, saying history would not be kind to your leader and to you as a member of the caucus if you vote to support the Liberals. Is there any chance that the New Democrats change their mind between now and the vote, which I presume will happen on Monday, based on everything you've heard and seen over the last little while?
Well, I think it's a bit rich for the Conservatives to come out with that line. I mean, right now, they strike me as a child who is playing with matches in a hay barn, is surprised that a fire started, and now is shocked that the fire brigade has shown up to put out the fire. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous from a party who has had members actively encouraging this occupation. I will reiterate that parliamentary oversight on this is very strong. All it takes, David, is for 20 members of Parliament to signal that they no longer want the Emergencies Act to be in effect. They send that, we can debate it again, and we can, as Parliament, basically overturn the inaction of the Emergencies Act. It is not a blank check. We are going to be watching this very closely. Okay. If we feel that the government is overstepping its bounds in any way, then we will
don't know what
withdraw.
They're doing. What happens between now and then? And those checks and balances aren't in place. Look, this needs to end. That has always been my position.
It does need to end, I agree.
But we have to be very careful here.
Waiting for this.
Okay.
The federal government didn't use these tools that they had at hand, and here we are. And I think we all need to have a moment of sobriety, tone down the rhetoric, and say the power that we're giving the federal government is unprecedented and needs to be checked.
Okay, we're out of time. I know we're going to talk about this more. I want to thank you both very much for joining me, Michelle Rempel-Garner, Alistair McGregor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.